Last week I went to Ark. I took a week off, mainly because the heatwave was causing me to cook inside my own skin, but also because I spent 3 days at the Olympia in London, chatting it up with fellow patriots on the conference floor from the UK, Australia, and the US. And that's the real value of Ark. Because absent Jordan Peterson, people are wondering why it's still going on, and because plenty of the speeches would have been really relevant if this was 2016, but I don't want to admonish it too much, I want to evaluate it, and I do want to praise it for bringing so many people together and having productive conversations, especially as Britain is going through a period of political tumult, especially on the ostensible right, and two of the three parties on the right were platformed at this event. That would be the Conservatives and Reform UK, but there were members of all three parties, Restore Britain included, represented on the show floor, and productive conversations were had. But for those who didn't go, this year had a much better venue. The Olympia was a much more well air-conditioned and bright venue than the aircraft hangar and dystopian setting of the Excel Centre last February. And the conference is deliberately elitist, so it's not open for general admission. You usually have to buy a premium ticket or get invited with a discounted ticket, thanks to the people on the organising committee that had facilitated my ability and my wife's ability to attend with me. And I actually appreciate this, because it means that the young people that are asked to attend are afforded prestigious opportunities based on the conversations that they have. Though, because of the wealth of young enterprising talent from all across the Anglosphere that do come to the conference, it would be more beneficial next time around for there to be some sort of stream to make use of that talent and have it shepherded in the right direction, more than just entrusting the right people to meet at the right times and exchange business cards or contact information. I'm sure plenty of that's going on. I'm sure plenty of people found it productive. I actually didn't. I hate networking. You know me. I'm a hobbit. I much prefer my study and my garden to large conferences and drinks events. Nevertheless, there are probably some projects that some of the ARC speakers or those hanging around in the VIP section would like to conscript young talent into, but beyond them going out of their way to connect with them on the ARC app, they're unlikely to actually headhunt that kind of talent. And so it would be wise for them to stay attentive to that. And it would also be wise for them to stay attentive to the fact that there were plenty of young people attending, mainly because ARC says that it would like to tell a better story for the next generation. But there weren't many speaking. And this was notable because it was only, I think, Freya India and my friend Chris Barnard who were speaking on the main stage. Freya India spoke about the plight of young women, difficulties of having relationships among the Zoomers and prospectively Gen Alpha as they start to age, and how social media interferes with our personal lives, causes us to commodify ourselves. And Freya is a very insightful writer, social commentator, and Chris spoke mainly about energy security and economic prospects for young people. None of those things rock the boat, or the ark, as it were, too much, whereas other more exuberant and rambunctious commentators, because Gen Z it clings to the taboos that the older generations revere, even on the right, far less. Because of that, I suspect that quite a few Zoomer voices were not included on fringe panel events or on the main stage, and I would just suggest that you would want to be in dialogue with said young people, and the avatars who are rivers to said people, in future if you want them to buy your better story, because if the Zoomers aren't buying what you're selling, then that's a cause for introspection rather than exclusion. That is just a suggestion to make ARC more relevant, because it's all well and good to have it be an expensive networking event that lots of people benefit from, me included, but if you want this conference to continue, especially because the absence of Jordan Peterson was really felt this year, prayers to Dr. Peterson. I know people have their political disagreements with him now, but it should not be understated how much he's done for young men, got lots of us this far. We can only hope that he is repaid in kind with a good bill of health well into his 70s so he can spend his time with his grandkids. But the absence of Dr. Peterson was palpable, and so if you need ARC to be something beyond Jordan Peterson, and you need it to be an intergenerational project, then you need to ensure that the speeches on stage are relevant, that the events you put on have interesting speakers, and that you speak about the topics that are pressing. And the gap, what I would like to call the sort of Fraser Nelson gap, between polite, prestigious opinion on the right, the establishment right, and what the majority of not just voters, but commentators, writers, autodidacts who were excluded from that establishment, what they're talking about, that phrase in Nelson Gap was present at ARC. And it is epitomised with the speech of its actual owner, not Jordan Peterson, but Paul Marshall. Now, Paul Marshall, obviously, hedge fund manager, owns GB News, heavily invested in the Pharos Institute, owns Unheard, The Spectator, was going to buy the Telegraph before the deal fell through and it got snapped up by the German owners of Politico, Bild, Welt, and other sort of left-wing media instead. Marshall, and we have mutuals, so I don't actually want to be hostile to Paul. I'm critical of his decision to make Michael Gove the Spectator editor and keep Freddie Sayers the editor of Unheard, because, again, both men don't know what time it is. Nevertheless, I've been told through mutuals that Marshall understands the issues at hand, and if he had a burner account that was, quote retweeting Carl Benjamin, and that was enough for Hope Not Hate to attack him, hey, maybe he's on side. Nevertheless, Marshall gave a speech where he was going through the 100-year history of wokeness, and he laid the preponderance of blame at the feet of postmodernism, and he still identifies as a classical liberal, as does Konstantin Kisin, who gave, I think it was the opening address, actually, and Konstantin said that liberalism has gone from the pursuit of freedom from tyranny, from the pursuit of freedom from reality, and I think that's accurate. Liberalism has metastasized, based on its original premises, into a universal acid that is tearing asunder all of the social bonds and traditional civic institutions like family, congregation, national identity, community, that kept our countries together, peaceful and prosperous. And so to say you're a classical liberal and the only problem is neo-Marxism or postmodernism, and that wokeness is some sort of aberration imposed upon Western societies rather than a poisonous seed which germinated in the fertile soil of liberalism, is very 2016. Like, we've already had these conversations, and it seems that analysis misses quite a large part of why our own culture is culpable for the present problems. Other people did highlight it, but when some of the most prestigious figures, literally the owner of ARC, are regurgitating talking points from about 10 years ago, I think ARC and the broader British right needs a political software update. And this isn't me being mean, this is just a pattern I saw throughout the conference. One of the most egregious examples was actually the foreign policy debate. Now, last year there was a trade debate featuring Michael Gove, and it went over so well they decided to recycle it again and have Michael Gove in the foreign policy debate. And it was Gove, Sebastian, Gorka, a former politician from Canada, and the lawyer Natasha Hausdorff. And there wasn't any substantive disagreement in the entire debate. Instead, it was all posturing about which side supported Israel and Ukraine harder. And the premise of the debate was that the rules-based international order is obsolete, and we are now in the era of great power politics. And Sebastian Gorka and Natasha Hausdorff were on the same side of the stage, and they were also on the same side of various foreign conflicts. But Natasha Hausdorff said the problem is with these institutions that they need to be reformed rather than abolished, and Seb Gorka was saying, look, we need to not kid ourselves, the American hegemon is only the hegemon because it has the sheer force of arms to enforce its will, and you better be glad that the Americans are broadly on Brits' side. But there was no challenging as to whether or not the last few decades of American hegemony being buttressed by the European Union, more or less, and British involvement in foreign conflicts in the Middle East, whether or not that was prudent. Because all voices on that stage would have supported the Iraq War, for example, or the recent war in Iran. There was nobody on stage challenging the prudence of engaging in that war in Iran in the first place. And I challenged it, full disclosure, because I hold no candle for the mullahs, but I think anyone could have seen that I don't think it's possible to win that. Like, deploying American boots on the ground, which is something that in recent days voices have been calling for in order to escalate the conflict, because the likes of Melanie Phillips or even some commentators in the US think that Trump's peace deal with Iran is somehow a betrayal, and so we need to stick American GIs on Carg Island or something. Yeah, that's a mountainous region, and it seems that the regime has even more support than back in January when Bibi Netanyahu was telling President Trump too rosy a picture about the Iraqi Kurdish protests in the north, saying the regime is on the precipice of being toppled, we'll be welcomed as liberators, all the same talking points we heard before. There was no voice on stage, this is my point, in the debate that was questioning the prudence of engaging in the conflict in the first place. There was no voice on stage who, I'm not going to say non-interventionist, but was talking about restraint in foreign policy. And instead, it just descended into, how dare you say President Trump wasn't supporting Israel because he got the hostages back and he's always opposed Iran. And it's like, yeah, great. Glad the hostages and unfortunately some of their bodies have been returned to their respective families. But there wasn't any substantive disagreement between the participants. It was just debating the instruments through which the policies that they all agreed on were enacted. And there is actually a very broad range of debate on the right, including in the MAGA coalition, and some who have found themselves on the outside of the MAGA coalition, no matter how much you may dislike them for other things that they say. And of course, in Britain, because the Conservatives and Reform were broadly for the Iran war. There were some dissenting voices in Reform, James Orr, Robert Jenrick. But then Restore Britain was against the Iran war, or at least involving Britain in the Iran war. So there is disagreement that isn't being represented on stage at ARC, and it would be useful to represent the opinions of the right so we could actually craft a better story or better policy solutions. That is, of course, presuming that that's the purpose. Otherwise, ARC will find itself being accused of being a limited hangout, which prohibits certain opinions from being platformed. And it was very noticeable. There was no talk of not just immigration in the demographic conversations, really, but of remigration, of the main solution to a lot of our problems. That wasn't discussed. In fact, Nigel Farage gave a sort of fireside chat with Baroness Stroud, who gives the opening address every day and sort of announces who the speakers are going to be and sort of sets the stage. And Baroness Stroud is, a long-time ally of David Cameron. She would be considered a soft evangelical Tory. I don't wish to mischaracterize or be insulting. Nevertheless, Nigel Farage had to almost force the immigration agenda into the conversation because there wasn't a question asked about immigration. It was mainly about demographics and family. And I found actually his answer on family really interesting because he started out by saying, look, we need to reconfigure the tax policies to make it so that working families have some assistance, some incentives to actually have children. It would be great if we could move back towards a single income provider model again, or at least a sort of a part-time work model, part-time remote for many women, because, Mary Harrington's book, Feminism Against Progress, does emphasize that women worked traditionally. They would just work for subsistence goods for the household and they'd be around their kids all the time. And that's what most women want. Most women don't want to have kids if they don't see their kids. It's understandable. It's something that has been discussed by the likes of Freya India or Stephen Shaw at ARC. So this is a pressing concern. But then when Philippa pressed on the problem with demographics and birth rates being more than an economic problem, Farage actually did something very interesting. He opened up about his own upbringing in the South Downs, and he spoke about how you would know your neighbours, and if the old woman next door didn't get her milk, then someone would walk it round, and how those third places which allowed you to know your neighbours. He said church, shop, pub. Britain is a nation of shopkeepers. The little churches that are dotted all around our country that you can show up to and have your coffee morning afterwards, and there's sort of intergenerational exchange of goodwill. And then the pub, the ultimate third place, where anything can be said, and yes, is the hotbed for revolutions, which is probably why the current Labour government want to shut it down, but also is a place of camaraderie and the cultivation of manners. It forces you to have moral consideration for people in a public space outside your own household. All of these things are being abolished. And Farage spoke in very sentimental ways about that. And I think accompanied with the aesthetics of Farage walking around the seaside in a barber jacket with his dogs, pointing out old abandoned military pillboxes and such. I think that's an authenticity that is being craved in politics, which the absence of which has landed Reform with accusations of being disingenuous used car salesmen. And I'm not trying to be insulting here. Again, consider me a critical friend. Especially after having met so many good people from actually all parties, but at ARC. I actually think that's the road that all politics should go down. Because one of the most regrettable things about the Makerfield by-election was just the vitriol being heaped on one another. And I don't want to engage in it. I would hope that I didn't. People are still engaging in it now. Matt Goodwin is still throwing insults my way. Unnecessary. But I would like to think that we could all be more cordial and sincere with one another. And I think that sincerity goes a long way. Anyway, that's just something I noticed on stage. Though I did find it conspicuous that Farage was platformed on day 2, Kemi Badenoch was platformed on day 1. And if you remember last year, the pattern was quite similar. Kemi Badenoch, I think, gave the opening address at ARC in 2025. And that's because plenty of people involved in ARC have costs sunk into Kemi. The architecture around Kemi Badenoch's leadership campaign was within the orbit of Michael Gove, Munira Mirza, Paul Marshall, and Neil Ferguson, who told me at the last ARC that we need politicians like Kemi Badenoch to make the case for integration to the sons and daughters of immigrants because white men like you and me are being obsolete. And I think actually, no, that's a misreading of the situation. The more we feel our demographic backs are up against the wall and our culture is being explained back to us as if it's not the property of us in particular, I think you'll get the rise of British identity politics, which I think is the driving force behind both Reform and Restore's support. And so it was conspicuous that Kemi Badenoch was given a similar interview by Philippa Stroud. Not because, if you look at the polling, at the very least, fine, you have to entertain the ideas that the Conservatives could retain some seats and possibly form the junior partner in a coalition. But everyone knows the Conservatives are never being elected back into government again. Because what they did while they were in government was an institutional betrayal. They are a tarnished brand. And even though there are good people working in Kemi's office even, or working for people like Katie Lamb, who herself is a good MP, public trust just isn't there, and I wouldn't be comfortable giving them another go at the levers of power. But it's conspicuous that both were platformed. And the reason is, ARC, without Jordan Peterson, seems to be an attempt to bring the Tories and Reform together. This is why, if you went onto the show floor, and you went into the room with all the booths, it was a bit tucked away to the side of the main stage. GB News had a booth, Unheard and The Spectator had a booth in the main area, you had the Pharos Foundation, you had the Free Speech Union, you had the Battle of Ideas, you had the good lads at the Prosperity Institute, who are currently writing policy that hopefully, the next government, no matter who they are, take up, because they're doing some really solid work, and more on sort of third-party institutions, policy and staffing in a minute, because I think that's actually the value that ARC can bring. You had all of these satellite organisations that are either friendly or involved in Reform and the Conservatives, and many are under the Marshall umbrella. Or at least they have personnel within them who are friends with one another. And what I think ARC is trying to do is unify the British right with some gentle encouragement from the Americans. And whether or not that unity is possible or desirable, because I think to my friends still in Reform listening, I think resist this with everything you've got, because what they're trying to do is convince you to factor into your electoral strategy, into your policy making, the idea that a pact with the Conservatives is inevitable, because they want to breathe life back into the Conservative corpse. I would resist this with everything you've got, because you can promise whatever policy you like, but if you have to deliver it with anticipating that James Cleverly will be working with you on it, then the horizons of possibility are much narrower, and we don't have time for that. Tory defectors are already seen as a self-inflicted wound in Reform. They shouldn't be actively engaging in this enterprise of pushing the Tories and Reform together, like the architects of our previous immiseration under the Conservatives, forcing two dolls to kiss. Like, we just don't want that. And actually, the purpose of ARC should be more than that. Because that's not what Peterson originally envisioned. Peterson envisioned it as a revival of Christian culture and the instilling of those virtues and that story into the next generation. And if all you're doing instead is shepherding two political parties together, one of which is utterly brand poisoned with the next generation, and the other, Reform, which doesn't really have any youth representation at the moment, then you're failing at the goal for which you were originally conceived. And I don't want to be harsh, because I actually really enjoyed attending, but nevertheless, there are some shortcomings. And there are some differences in vision between the attendees and the people on stage. So, for example, Farage did a really good job of reiterating the problem of immigration, which wasn't given attention by ARC during any of their sessions. And apparently during the demographic dinner, there was a question about remigration asked, and the panelists didn't want to address it. Whereas, that's the main policy you can do to rectify our dire demographic circumstances. Like, my kids are going to be a minority in their own generation in 5 years. Without remigration, everything else is just window dressing. You're just talking past the problem. And they didn't mention it, and you actually do need a panel on immigration. How about a debate on it? A debate on deportations. Platform someone who is like a mainstream right-wing politician and a immigration commentator or writer, someone who's got expertise in the subject, and then platform someone who's a bit softer on it, someone who's like really pro-integration. Hell, you could even have Michael Gove again. And then have someone who is outright hostile to the prospect of immigration being a bad thing. So we can all, get our tomatoes and eggs ready to throw at Fraser Nelson. Otherwise, elephant in the room, guys, and you're going to consign yourselves to irrelevance. And then just one more thing to pick up on in Farage's speech. It's worth watching some of these. One of the problems Reform has is it continually situates its moral concern outside the British people. It used to be because they would waffle on about British values, right? This was Zia Yusuf's opening conference speech in 2024 before the election. That Reform is a party of British values and Britain is a nation of values. And no. And you can see some of that ebbing away because they realise that the locus of moral concern resides in people. Now, it's not yet the exclusive British people. Someone needs to frankly talk to Farage on this and nail down his definition of what a British person is, because it isn't accurate, and I just don't think we should be telling untruths, no matter how politically expedient you think they might be, no matter how necessary you think they might be to win an election, no matter how polite you think they might be. We should just be firm on who the British people are and the fact that they possess their own country. But they've now gone to groups of people. And the problem that Reform will run into is it is against identity politics. It is promoting a piece of legislation that mandates that everyone must be treated fairly under the law. But not only are there sort of candidates that are put forward, escalated up the ladder because they're Muslim, like Layla Cunningham, who just seems to me to be a liability, to be frank. I don't see how you can keep her around for very much longer, but there you go. But not only is it that, it is that Reform has a Jewish Alliance and a Friends of Israel group. Now, there will be people debating the merits of having that for foreign policy reasons. I don't think it's a great idea to have a member of Israeli Labour in your party. Nevertheless, you can't have that and then also be messaging, as Farage did on stage, saying you're really worried about anti-Semitism and you want to ban the Muslim Brotherhood because it's causing these Islamic terror attacks against Jews and also discouraging investment from the Emiratis, where there are lots of business interests, where Farage has visited before to try to smooth things over from Dubai because there's lots of British expats there. Okay, right, fine, I understand that. But the moment you do that, you are situating your concern outside the British people themselves to either minority interest groups who have your moral concern, and don't get me wrong, I understand it, I have some Jewish friends, I don't want to see them butchered either, or foreign investment, like the UAE, while also saying the British people don't get to take their own side, even though those groups that we grant moral concern have special interest groups. Like, you can't really say the British people can be anyone and we don't want to play identity politics, while also, having a Reformed Jewish Alliance and saying I'm concerned about anti-Semitism. Because if you're concerned about the threat posed by Islam to Jews, then the same goes for the native British people. And it's fine to talk in those terms. It doesn't mean that you hate any one group or another. It just means you're concerned about your own nation's well-being. And that's fine, because we're all motivated by a love of what is most familiar to us. And I say all of this because I'm going to be raising 2 daughters now in the country that these people want to govern. So I want to know that they're concerned about me. And I want to know it in their explicit rhetoric, not just having to infer via policy that I'm going to be better off as a result of it. Especially when they are explicit about their sentimental and moral concern for other groups. And this is ground that reform can actually beat Kemi Badenoch on, because when Kemi was talking about championing family, in response to a question about demographic decline, she didn't mention immigration. Unlike Nigel Farage, she's taken immigration out of the slogans on her podium. And she talks about British culture rather than British values, but again, she talks about the culture as if it's something disconnected from the people themselves, as if it's not the collective possession or thing produced by British people. And it's because she's a first-generation Nigerian immigrant. And so, if you are pairing like for like here, if the policies that are on offer are almost identical, but the delivery is a 1,000-step journey, then Kemi can only ever take 999, whereas a party led by and for British people can take all 1,000. And again, that doesn't mean being mean or inconsiderate to people based on their heritage. It's just about representation. It's just about speaking from within your group on your side, about taking your side, about being concerned for your well-being and your interests and your children's future. Just as they speak in those terms for other groups such as Jews and worries about anti-Semitism, which was of course quite a prominent feature at ARC. And Kemi also said, why does the Conservative Party matter? And she said, we're the vehicle for common sense. Lol, Lamau even. Now, whereas the next step for reform is to regain some of the credibility it has lost by taking on Tory defectors, by flip-flopping on policy, by appearing insincere in their messaging, which is recoverable, granted. The problem the Conservatives have is no matter how publicly they scrub their hands, they're still going to be sullied with blood. They are Lady Macbeth. They're going to be driven mad by their own inability to expunge their guilty consciences of the Boris Wave, or Net Zero, or the Equality Act, or putting the trans madness on steroids, or destroying the economy, lockdown, vaccine passports, suggesting mandatory jabs, and just the series of sleaze and scandals caused by various Conservative politicians. The much-celebrated first trans MP that turns out to have crashed his car after a midnight liaison with another fella and ran away like Mrs. Doubtfire. It's all just completely embarrassing, and frankly unrecoverable. And this isn't to say that there aren't still good people trapped in that party. And again, me acknowledging that is genuinely me trying to be praiseworthy of their individual efforts, and to be gentlemanly. I gain nothing by saying that, because I'm banned from both the Conservatives and Reform, remember, despite having some friends in Reform HQ. So all of this is to reiterate that ARC can't just be about pushing Conservatives and Reform together, because it's an enterprise which I think is unnecessary, is, despite having lots of money, power, and intention behind it, undesirable, and it's something that nobody under 40 outside of the Westminster bubble actually cares about. So you might want to plug into what the young attendees were talking about. You might want to platform some of them. This is not my pitch to say I should be on stage, by the way. I should have said that earlier in the video. I have it on good authority that I am far beyond the pale. But there are lots of young, talented people that were in attendance, that are doing great work, that should be up there. They should be, headlining fringe events or something. So that should be a top priority for next year. A couple of other things that were worthy of note. Catherine Birbalsingh gave a speech. And it's pretty good, actually. I saw Catherine. We both said hello, despite her thinking I am the Antichrist, based on my views and my pessimism about the prospect of integration. But Catherine opened her speech by talking about Henry Novak. And she actually made quite a powerful point, so I'm just going to play this clip.
A few weeks ago, We all saw the same footage. A young man called Henry Novak, barely out of childhood, handcuffed on the ground, begging the police for help. And what followed was the confusion of our commentators as they struggled to explain how our young police officers, sworn to protect the public, could behave in such a way. No one seemed to have a convincing answer. But when you spend a lifetime in schools, it's pretty clear what's going on. Those young police officers are not a special case. They're collateral damage, and the pattern runs far further afield than policing. Last September, Charlie Kirk was shot, and within hours, young people were celebrating all over the internet, despite the fact that his 2 little children would have to grow up without their father. Many of us looked on in disbelief. What has happened to the moral core of our young people? Something has changed profoundly in how our young people see the world. Those police officers were not evil. They were not incompetent. They were terrified. Terrified of being seen as racist.
Now, Catherine's correct. All of that is absolutely true. But it's correct for mainly the white populations of the West. They have been taught self-hatred. And so later on when she talks about the curriculum in her speech, she mentions that if you ask anyone what they learned about at school, it's Hitler, it's the civil rights marches in America despite living in Britain, it's the transatlantic slave trade. You never learn about the abolition of the slave trade, you never learn about the Arab slave trade and the Barbary pirates, you never learn about the unique historical expenditure that the British Empire did in order to vanquish the slave trade in other countries. You learn about the world as being a series of migratory patterns, meaning that Britain has always been a nation of immigrants, which is just a lie. You learn more about queer, feminist, black poets than you do about Chaucer, Keats, Wordsworth, Wilfred Owen anymore. And she's right. It's to discourage our children from being grateful to have inherited these cultural artifacts, to call them their own, to want to propagate them out to their own children in the future, to essentially be righteous cultural chauvinists about their own history, heritage, and identity. It's what Yuri Bezmenov warned about. It's systematic demoralization to wage a slow revolution in our countries. All of those points are relevant to the white Western populations of our countries. However, if we end up with the demographics of the Michaela School, all of these conversations are moot. All of them. Everything about demographics, energy security, political stability, our story, our shared values, our history, because it's no longer ours. Because another people cannot possess the collective property of another people. And trying to instill in them a love of something that isn't their own is much more difficult than reviving that lost love in our own populations. And so it's important to harp on this. I'm not attacking Catherine. We've had our debate, views are out there. It's important to harp on this because, of course, Paul Marshall was an advisor at the Department of Education working under Michael Gove and pushed forward the free school reforms that led the Michaela School to exist. And now both Suella Braverman over at Reform UK as their education spokesperson and Danny Kruger, who is preparing for the getting ready for government department, all of their civil service reforms, but also, Kemi Badenoch. They have praised Catherine Birbal Singh's school as a model not just for schooling, but for integration and the kind of culture, a kind of muscular liberalism, liberal conservatism, that we should adopt, which is anachronistically indifferent to our national faith, which is Christianity, and which polices the frictions between identity groups by trying to treat everyone as an individual, but then suppressing certain cultural identities until they're so inconsequential that they are just food and clothing. And I just don't think that's going to work. And this debate will be obsolete if the British people themselves disappear in their own country. And Catherine conceded that in our discussion. And this is why ARC needs to actually platform a conversation about arresting that demographic decline. Otherwise, not only is ARC obsolete in a few years with the generation that are particularly perturbed about having to live with those consequences. But in a couple of decades' time, ARC won't be running because it won't be the same people living in this country willing to have this conversation. Instead, we'll be like South Africa or Lebanon. And that's not what any of us want, I would hope. It's just about putting the uncomfortable pieces together in your own head that show that we will get there if we continue on our present trajectory. And so, praiseworthy speech about the substance of the education curriculum. This is why it's very important, and I think Suella Braverman actually has this in mind, because she's got a good team around her. This is why it's important to break up the teachers' unions, target the National Education Union, which has shared executives with the Socialist Workers' Party, Stand Up to Racism, all these people that send out literature to teachers across the country saying to come to this counter-demonstration against the far right, which is just, mums and dads who don't want migrant rapists in a hotel opposite their daughter's school where said teachers work. It's important to do that, and it's important to restrict the remit of the national curriculum so that teachers can't use certain topics to become political activists in the classroom, to lie to their students, to make them miserable and hate their own country. All of that's really important. But the demographic foundations are what underpin all of these conversations. It's what allows us to have these conferences in air-conditioned venues, in relatively polite and peaceful and prosperous countries, right? And that peace and prosperity is slipping away, and it will not be there for my daughters if you don't do something about it. Feels really strange to say that, rather than just my hypothetical children. Pray for me, I'm a girl dad in the making. The main benefit of ARC, though, just to finish, the main benefit of ARC was bringing so many of our American friends over. And I say this because I've missed a bunch of my friends working in the Trump administration and aligned institutions. I got talking to the Mass Deportation Coalition guys. I've previously covered their work. I'll link that down in the description. The Trump administration should be listening to them because they have the playbook for getting your domestic agenda back on track and making MAGA an intergenerational victory, right? Because if you rectify America's dire demographic circumstances, if you reimpose the rule of law, if you regain a sense of possession over your country and culture again, then you'll never get tired of winning. But the American right is more motivated and powerful and cohesive, despite the dispute playing out between prospective 2028 presidential candidates and some of the members of MAGA base and Trump himself over the Iran war, which again I don't support, despite me having disagreements with some of the members of that sort of podcast sphere that are having their battles with Trump. Nevertheless, America is in a healthier state than the British right at the moment. And you could sense that at ARC, right? The anxieties of the people managing ARC were trying to be assuaged by platforming Kemi Badenoch and Nigel Farage, and Danny Kruger spoke on the last day, who used his speech to reiterate that reform's agenda is not attacking individual people, but it's attacking things like a particular branch of Islam which has political ambitions. I think that's just Islam, I'm afraid. You're not going to be able to split hairs on that. Or, for example, I thought this was actually quite a compelling line of argument from Danny, who I'm sure that the secret is out that I think he's much too soft in his rhetoric and approach, and I'm sure word has reached his ears, and I don't want to be insulting. Chalk it up to passion. I'm a bit of a rhetorical pugilist. Actually, I ran into Emma Trimble on the show floor. Wonderful woman, does great work on New Culture Forum, carrying the torch of Peter Whittle, and she did joke with me, just saying, look, I have a reputation for being an internet firebrand, but actually one-on-one I'm quite personable and polite. I'm a big softie, really. If you follow my wife's Instagram, you won't because it's private. You just see a steady stream of me like holding owls or feeding donkeys or ducks. So, yes, I do have a secret sensitive side. Anyway, complete detour. Forgive me, Danny Kruger. Anyway, what ARC actually did was bring the US right and the UK right together at a time where the UK right needs some guidance or like a firm hand on its shoulder. And this doesn't mean that we want to become an American export. It doesn't mean that the Americans are meddling in our politics. It means, much like the rhetoric from Farage and Kemi towards Jewish communities in London, there is a patrician concern for a group of people that you have an affinity for. Like, for example, I would love to see the Japanese thrive and get out of their demographic and economic doldrums. Not because I'm Japanese, not because I have any business interests in Japan, but because I like Japanese people, I like Japanese culture. It's basically the Britain of the Orient. I want to steal their trains. Like, can we just have a bullet train from London to Glasgow? That would be fantastic. We need the Japanese people in order to survive, in order to help us with that. You know, Anglo-futurism with vaguely samurai characteristics. And so, I want to see the Japanese succeed sentimentally. And the Americans feel the same, because the Americans feel that we are their motherland, and it makes them grieve for the state of our country. And so Sarah Rogers, who's the Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy over at the State Department, she does some fantastic tweets about the state of migrant crime and free speech, or lack thereof, in the UK, gave a really strong speech. And she contrasted Kunmi Drukpa's concept of the UK, Y-O-O-K-A-Y, where your son can be stabbed by a Sikh and then arrested and told, I don't think you have, mate, under suspicion of racism, where you've got these incongruous aesthetics of women in hijabs greeting you at Heathrow Airport, and then chicken shops, vape shops, Turkish barbers, red phone boxes that used to be the landmarks of London, smothered in orange spit from the pan chewing tobacco, chomped up by members of the Indian subcontinent. Like, all of these incongruous, incoherent, ugly foreign impositions on our culture, she contrasted that with the Great Britain of her ancestors, because her great, keep going, grandfather sailed from Devon as a pilgrim settler to the United States. And she used that example to say that Britain has a civilisational kinship and inheritance with America. And this is why you get Marco Rubio speaking at the Munich Security Conference about his ancestors from Spain, and how the Spanish informed the cowboy archetype, allowed America to settle the frontier and build its national monomyth of heroic, rugged individuals. It's why you get President Trump, when he greeted King Charles III coming over, talking about the great ancestral ties between Britain and America. You know, American Congress even has a sergeant at arms. That's inherited from Parliament. It's why you get J.D. Vance and the rest of the State Department, like Secretary Rubio's ambassador, talking about the existential threats to Western civilization being demographic decline, being mass migration, and a loss of confidence in ourselves, being unable to take our own side. So the reason I'm talking about all this is because these are the themes that our American friends tried to remind us of in their speeches, in their conversations in and around the conference. They're trying to encourage the British right, particularly Reform, I think, to take the side of the British people, because the Americans see that the British people produced America. And if they disappear, they become a hated minority in their own country. They lose possession of their country. That their distinct culture and ways of governance go extinct because the people go extinct. Then America will lose a great ally, but they'll also lose their inheritance. They'll lose that living connection back to their founding fathers. And I'm not saying we should save Britain for America's sake, but I am saying that ARC should listen to them. If it's going to platform them, listen to the message. If the State Department are saying that demographic displacement, white flight, is a concern of, quote, civilisational erasure for Europe and the UK, okay, have a conversation about it. Have conversations about immigration at the next ARC. Produce a paper on it. You've got so many researchers working under Nigel Biggar, spending quite a lot of time and capital and expertise on this sort of stuff. And if you're going to face civilisational challenges like the ethics around AI, Mary Harrington gave a decent talk on that, then shouldn't immigration and demographics be your primary concern too? It doesn't matter how icky you might find it. What matters is pursuing demographic security for our populations so that you have the foundations to have these conversations in future. Because these other incoherent populations who have no frame of reference for why they should revere our values or our story or our heroes or our faith, they won't be having these conversations if our countries fall apart and become favelas and third world slums. And so the value of ARC is there. It just needs to be capitalised on. Final thought from me After having a series of good conversations at ARC, there's things I can't announce. But there are a series of sort of third institutions outside of political parties that play the role that I've tried to play, which is very similar to David Starkey's role, right? That of a critical friend, trying to encourage parties to adopt necessary policies and discouraging them from using rhetoric or adopting policies which limits their room to maneuver and inhibits them from solving problems. And there are institutions being built, or which already exist, which are trying to do that. Cross-party cooperation, even international cooperation, to try to ensure that mistakes aren't made, necessary policies are fleshed out, and that the right personnel is in place, because it's not just about winning parliamentary seats for like 300 patriots to pass bills that have already been drafted. You also need to replace most of the civil service. You also need a legion of competent lawyers to ensure you can withdraw from the ECHR and you don't step on all of the tripwires laid for you in the Belfast Agreement and the Windsor Framework, to ensure that you have a watertight way of circumventing grit thrown in the gears by a recalcitrant civil service. You need to be able to fire them and rehire people that will enact your agenda. And that's the thing that I mainly want to focus on. I'm going to be hopefully involved in some endeavours doing that going forward, while also keeping up my show and appearing on other shows, trying to raise awareness of why these measures are necessary. Analysing political discourse, sort of gently suggesting better ways of framing things to our politicians. And that was the benefit of ARC for me. I learned that that's actually resonating, not just with some fairly senior figures in political parties, but also with loads of you. So thank you to everyone that came up to me throughout the 3 days, mobbed me. I got about 1 10-minute break at 3:30 on the final day, where I disappeared upstairs to the empty media and interviewing balcony and just monged out in a chair. Other than that, there was a constant procession of people talking to me, giving me books, interviewing me, like thanking me for my work, which I'm humbled by. I hope you get something more interesting to listen to at some point. But I'm glad this provides value. And it is surprising to me that there are very few shows like it, actually, in the UK, because this kind of format is ubiquitous throughout the US. It's actually, heavily financially backed if you're working over at the likes of Daily Wire. Despite them taking a nosedive in terms of their analytics, they're still getting like $100 million bailout. There's no such money flowing around in British alternative media, I can tell you that. But I thank everyone for watching. I thank everyone who wants to have a conversation about all sorts of encouraging opportunities, and I hope I have some good news going forward. And in the spirit of encouragement, I would just say to ARC, make use of the talent which is already attending your conference, and address the civilisational concerns that the likes of the US State Department have helpfully made mainstream for you already.